in the market for an affordable Corvette, these three cars are going to be your primary focus points. Three generations of Corvette, which are by far the cheapest in the lineup. The C4 Corvette, the C5 Corvette, and the C6 Corvette. And in this video, Case and I are going to figure out which one is best and which one fits your needs.
The C4 Corvette went from 1984 all the way to 1996. That's when the C5 took over from 1997 to 2004, and then the C6 went from 2005 to 2013.
In this video, we are going to focus on the standard Corvettes. We're not looking at special editions, which may include the Grand Sport or the Z01 or Z06, depending on generation, because those are going to cost more and prices on those are really all over the board. We're focusing on the standard run-of-the-mill Corvette that you see a lot of. Now let's talk quickly about values, because they really range a lot depending on the year and generation. But as a rough rule of thumb, a C4 Corvette can be had in decent condition from anywhere between $8,000 to maybe $15,000. Case paid $10,000 for this 1988 model. The C5 Corvette, once again in standard form, can be had anywhere from about $14,000 to about $20,000 in standard form. We paid $14,000 for this example. And then the C6 Corvette, well, this is where we're going to see the largest price variation, but once again in standard form between about $23,000 and about $36,000. All right, Case, let's dive into C4 specifics, see what's good and see what's not.
When the C4 Corvette launched in 1984, it had the Crossfire injection V8, which is an engine that's not that well regarded by enthusiasts. It's possible to keep one running and operating, but most people tend to go for this, the L98 Tune Port injection V8 that came out in 1985 and went all the way to 1991. Partly because it's a more dependable powertrain. You also saw a power bump from 205 horsepower in the Crossfire injection V8 to 245 horsepower like in this 1988 L98. And then in 1992, you had the option of getting the LT1 V8, which is what a lot of people tend to go for because that even saw another power bump to 300 horsepower. However, there are some people who prefer these L98s because they don't like messing with the OptiSpark systems on the LT1s.
With the introduction of the C5 Corvette came the introduction of the legendary LS small block Chevrolet engine. Now what you're looking at here is the LS1 V8 rated at 345 horsepower. And throughout the C5 run, the LS1 didn't change much between 1997 and 2004. Post 2000, it got a slight horsepower bump up to 350. Now the LS1 is certainly a major reason a lot of folks select the C5 over a C4. Bulletproof engine, a little bit more modern. All these cars ran on OBD2 technology, so diagnosis is a little bit easier, especially compared to the earlier C4 Corvettes. It's a great engine.
And finally, the C6 Corvette saw this, the LS2 V8 when it launched with 400 horsepower, a headline figure. However, in 2008, they went from the LS2 to the LS3, which saw a bump from 400 to 430 horsepower and from 6 liters to 6.2 liters. So one of the reasons that there are such large price disparities on these C6 Corvettes is because cars 2008 later with the LS3 engines tend to go for a lot more. The vast majority of C4 Corvettes, something like 80% of them were had with automatic transmissions. However, it is possible to find a manual like this 88, and up until 1989, if you got the manual option instead of a 4-speed automatic, you would have this Doug Nash 4+3, which is a 4-speed transmission with an overdrive that you can kick on in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th gear, hence the name 4+3. It's a strange transmission and it's very agricultural with very long shifts, especially compared to the 6-speed ZF that came out in '89. However, I haven't had any problems with mine, and it is kind of an interesting piece of history.
The C5 Corvette was available in 2 transmissions. So the manual transmission was a 6-speed T56 manual, and then if you got the automatic like this car, well, you got the 4L60E, which was a venerable transmission GM used across many product lines, including their large SUVs. Now, one interesting fact about the C5 is for weight distribution, they moved the transmission from just behind the engine to the rear axle. So the transmission in this car is actually at the rear end of the vehicle. Now, the 4L60E, like in this car, is a 4-speed automatic. Once again, the vast majority of C5s you're going to find are going to have the automatic transmission, and there's a big price gap between the 4-speed and the 6-speed manual. Depending on your area, it can be as much as $2,000, $3,000, even $4,000.
Now, the C6 Corvette has an interesting history with its transmissions because in 05 only these cars had the 4L60E like in the C5 Corvette, so a 4-speed. However, if you get anything other than a 2005 model, then you get upgraded to the 6L80, which gets you a 6-speed. However, this car has the transmission that you really want, which is again a T56 6-speed. Now, the C4 Corvette initially launched with this more angular styling than what you see on these later model Corvettes. However, this particular body style on the Corvette did change in 1991, where instead of the back end of the car being dished out like this, it was a little bit more convex. They also changed the front end and they changed these side vents as well.
Now, the C5 generation of Corvette brought in a new era of design for General Motors, so it's much more rounded, much more smoothed out. You still get the pop-up headlights, but there's a bunch of fundamental changes between the design of the C4 and the C5. For example, the fuel filler has moved from the rear deck lid in the C4 to the side on the C5. You also get the center high-mounted taillight, which is located here on the rear end versus up there near the roof. And a couple other things which is worth noting is on the C5 Corvette, the center panel, which debuted many generations before on Corvette, is much easier to take out and stow away. So at the flip of a little handle, you can pull it out, stick it in the trunk, whereas on the C4, it's a little bit more involved.
While the C6 is certainly a more mild update coming from the C5 than it was the jump from C4 to C5, one of the most major changes is the step away from pop-up headlights. So this is just a fixed headlight design. However, one interesting fact about the C6 in comparison to the C5 is that it's actually 5 inches shorter. They massively reduced the overhang on this car. When it comes to the interior of the C4 Corvette, I will say ingress and egress, especially if you're older and not quite so limber, can be a little awkward because the sill here is massive. Now, this being a 1988 has the earlier model interior, so I have my digital gauges, and it's a much blockier, more old school kind of retro shape to the interior than the interior that you got starting in 1990, which did modernize it a lot. It did improve many aspects of the interior, including the step away from these digital gauges, which most people really dislike. However, depending on what your preference is in terms of style, for some people, the earlier interior is better.
Stepping into the C5, there is an enormous difference with entry and exit. So that enormous side sill has been removed on the C5, and they found structural rigidity elsewhere in the platform. This car actually uses a lot of advanced materials, especially for the late 90s. Like the floors are made out of a balsa wood composite plastic, which is really interesting. Now, another major aspect they focused on when it came to the interior of the C5 was squeaks and rattles. So a lot of Corvette owners complained about squeaks, rattles, going over bumps and that kind of thing. So they reduced a lot of that in the C5 Corvette. It was a really big point of pride. What they didn't improve, and arguably made worse compared to the C4, was interior design. So everything is essentially the same black hard plastic. The radio is largely the same as anything you'd find in like a Silverado. The climate controls are basic. The steering wheel is kind of late 90s, blocky and chunky. The interior is pretty boring, and it is quite cheap. So even though it doesn't rattle as much, it's not as an exciting place to be from a vintage kind of experience perspective. One thing which is cool are the gauges. They have got a full gauge cluster, which have various faces on different planes, which was very advanced for the late 90s. So overall, interior is less squeaky than the C4 Corvette, but certainly less interesting as well.
Like the C5, the C6 is reasonably easy to get in and out of, and this interior overall is a massive improvement over the C5. It's much better looking and much more modern. You could even get some of these cars with a navigation screen. That being said, it's not a spectacular interior, but relative to the C5, it is much better. Still a very cool gauge pack, and like all 3 of the Corvettes here, it's a very easy process to take this top off, store it in the back, and turn it into somewhat of a convertible. And a lot of decently modern features here. You have heated seats, your doors are electronically opened and closed, and of course you've got push button start. Now in a lot of ways these cars are all very comparable. However, because these cars come from different eras, they all have some pretty unique features. So we're going to go through 3 unique features on all 3 of these cars. And to start off on the C4 Corvette, you have this handbrake here on the left. So you pull it up to engage it like you would expect. However, that would make your ingress and egress even worse. So what it does is once it's engaged, it just drops right down. And in order to disengage it, you pull it up, you can take pressure off of it and drop it, and now it is disengaged. Another fan favorite feature on the C4 Corvette are the pop-up headlights. Of course, something very common in this era. However, the way that the headlights pop up and down on the Corvette is especially cool because they do that rotation. Now, you might be thinking, Corvette, not very practical, only a 2-seater, and you don't have a ton of space to store things. And of course, I do have a console here. I can also lock and unlock some cubbies here in the back for additional storage. And you know, it's not cavernous, but you can actually move this out of the way and then it gets even deeper.
Now, as we move into the C5, some interesting features on this Corvette. You could option this vehicle with an active handling package, which gave you this ride control selector. So there's actually 3 different settings for the shock absorbers: Tour, Sport, and Performance. In the real world, the difference between these 3 is pretty minor, but the cost to replace the shocks is pretty major. C5 Corvettes have some of the most interesting switch and lock controls in the industry. I think they wanted to differentiate this car from other GM products, so they gave these super squishy buttons underneath this kind of like neoprene panel, and that's how you control the windows, the locks, and even the mirrors, is via these little squishy buttons. And just like Case's Corvette, there are secret cubbies in the C5 as well. Now granted, they're not lockable, but I would argue the car's got central locking, which is far easier to use than that C4. But anyways, the cubbies are huge. So you got this big central cubby. You can see that kind of pops off like that. You also have these side cubbies, which really are super deep. And when you have them all off, you find that there's a ton of just space to store things. It's pretty good.
While the C6 Corvette did make an effort towards being modern with features like this proximity key, there are other areas where they skimped out, like the steering wheel that is exactly the same wheel that you would get in a Chevy Cobalt. I mentioned them briefly while talking about the interior, but the door handles on this car are electronic, so instead of having a traditional latch, you have this electronic switch here underneath this pad. To get the door back open again, of course, you have another electronic switch. So if you're looking for a latch of some kind, you're not gonna find it. Though it may not be the greatest heads-up display in the world, these C6s do have them, and while it was an option in the C5, they're more common here in these C6s. You can also cycle the heads-up display through different modes. Now, the C4 Corvette is the cheapest, part of the reason that I bought this one, and this is the one that I would stick with. That being said, it is also the slowest, and being the oldest, it's probably going to need the most amount of love and maintenance of all 3. So depending on what you're looking for, a car that is very fast straight out of the box, a car that is still respectably fast and decently affordable, or something a little bit more retro that serves as a great cruiser, you really can't go wrong with any one of them.
As Case mentioned, if you just want the most performance for the dollar, C6 Corvette all the way. Especially an LS3 car provides you so much horsepower, straight line acceleration, and handling prowess relative to anything else for the money. If you want the most experience from a classic car standpoint, C4 is the way to go. You know, we haven't talked about C3 because a lot of those are still pretty expensive and pretty old, but you know, C4 gives you a very 80s experience and really gives you a story to tell behind the wheel. Now for me, C5 is a sweet spot. In fact, so much of a sweet spot, I just bought this car off of TFL. That's how much I liked it. Because it's still very affordable like a C4, but you can track them more easily. They'll take a little bit more abuse on an autocross or you know, a track day scenario. So for me, I think C5 is kind of the sweet spot. But guys, we'd love to know your impressions. Hope this video helped you at least a little bit. And as always, this has been Tommy behind the camera Case. We'll see you on the next episode.